So now that we've seen the 3 levels of biodiversity that we see on Earth, and we've also established a reason to actually care about this biodiversity, we'll continue talking about that biodiversity in this next video, but specifically the threats that we see to such biodiversity. So we'll entitle this next flowchart actually, Biodiversity, Roman numeral 2, with a specific and key focus on the threats to biodiversity. So let's see. What is causing biodiversity to either decrease, increase, whatever it may be? What are the threats? Now, first and foremost, one of the most obvious ones, many people know about this, is habitat loss. Habitat loss is a key threat to biodiversity. Because of habitat loss, we get something known as fragmentation. This is a bad thing on the scope of conservation biology, and we'll define fragmentation as the following. It's when we take something like a big habitat, normally a large, big habitat, very expansive habitat, and we turn it into, with this forward-facing arrow, and we break it down, let's say. It's broken down, this large habitat, this big habitat is broken down into what we would call fragments, thus the name fragmentation. So what's the big deal? What happens if we break down a big habitat into fragments? Well, through this habitat loss, this form of habitat loss specifically, what we get are smaller populations. Now, this is not necessarily a bad or a good thing, but it's the context of these smaller populations. When you have smaller populations plus the habitat fragmentation that I just mentioned, so we'll write plus habitat frag for fragmentation, that's when we are going to be getting a bad living scenario. If we have smaller populations and habitat fragmentation, then we get these small populations that have or are equal to an increased probability. These small populations will have a very increased probability of local extinction. And this is going to be a direct result of just having a smaller environment. When you have a smaller population within a small environment, a fragment of the environment, you're going to have a greater chance of a local extinction event based off of our definition of local extinction. So we go from large, big populations to smaller populations, large, big areas to smaller habitat fragments. Thus, we get a higher probability of local extinction, all due to habitat loss. Now, another threat to biodiversity that's important to understand is this idea of an introduced species. So let's do that one right over here. So let's imagine we have something called an introduced species. And this is a big one because it's a main component for why we have a lot of extinctions. An introduced species is simply going to be referred to also as an exotic species oftentimes. So what happens when we have these introduced species and exotic species? What even are these species? We can define them as the following. So I'll do the definition over here way onto the side. It's a bit wordy definition. This is going to be when we have the accidental or intentional. So it's accidental or intentional movement by humans of species, so it could be several different species or many species at least. So the accidental or intentional movement of humans by humans of species from native location. So we'll write from, that's the key here, native location, and of course they're moving somewhere, so it's going to be to new geographical regions. So we'll say new geographical regions. Sorry for the tight spelling and writing over here. So let's reiterate. When we have an introduced species, we take accidentally or intentionally some species from its native location to a new geographical region. Again, this is a human construct. It's a human involvement. So now, once we have this definition, let's take a look at what happens. Let's imagine we have this species in its native habitat. Okay, let's imagine this species is in its good old native habitat, the normal habitat that it's in. Here, this is where we're going to have populations that are limited, okay? Pops are going to be limited. Pops are limited in their normal habitat. And this is mainly because in their normal habitat, there are things like predators that are normally naturally there. There are things like parasites that are normally naturally there in this native habitat. And there are pathogens that are just floating around because this is just the norm. This is every single habitat has this. Every native habitat had this. But what happens when you take it out of its native location, out of its native habitat, and you introduce it to, that's the name introduce, or make it an exotic species in its new habitat? So what happens if you move it to a new habitat? If it's in a new habitat, you now are presenting most of the time a period in which, or an area in which, you have no real constraints. Previously, we had constraints. We had predators, we had parasites, we had pathogens. I could even say we have intraspecific competition. All of those things are constraints. But in this new habitat, there are no constraints. What's going to happen is, naturally, we expect this species, this introduced species, to spread too rapidly. It's going to spread way too rapidly, more than we would ever imagine, and this spreading, this rapid spreading, can seriously cause damage overall to the entire ecological landscape. So we're going to say just cause damage. Now, important number to put to this introduced species concept, we have done this over and over and over again, many different examples of this. About 40% of all extinctions that have happened since 1950 are due to this introduced species concept. So many extinctions are due to the fact that we introduce new native species from their native habitat into a new habitat, giving them no constraints, having them spread way too rapidly. Now, that's another major threat to biodiversity, as is habitat loss. A new threat to biodiversity, independent of this one, is something called overharvesting. So let's see, what is overharvesting? Overharvesting can be defined as the following. This is when we are harvesting wild organisms. Let me write this down. We are harvesting wild organisms, ORGS for organisms, at rates exceeding their ability to rebound. Their ability to rebound. So when we keep on harvesting over and over and over and over again and do not even give them the opportunity to rebound, we have exceeded their ability to rebound. We are creating a species that is at risk. And now, speaking of a species at risk, the species in this situation that would be most at risk, let's say most at risk of this overharvesting concept, would be a species that is in a restricted habitat, let's say we are deforesting or something. If we're in a restricted habitats, so HABs for habitats, and this species also has a notoriously low repro rates. If they have restricted habitats and low repro rates, then we are certainly going to be promoting this idea of overharvesting. Examples of organisms that have restricted habitats and low repro rates are things like elephants, rhinos. Those are very nearly extinct. Even things like whales. All of these are animals that we overharvest for their resources. Elephants usually for those ivory tusks, same thing in that rhino scenario, and whales for their blubber. All of these things are against species that are at most risk because they have restricted habitats, because they have low reproduction rates. Thus, we promote their threat to biodiversity by overharvesting them faster than they can possibly rebound. Finally, last thing to understand about the threats to biodiversity is the idea of global change. Global change can be defined as the following. This is when we have alterations, and this is something of great interest to us, very important in recent news, current events, all the time. The idea of alterations to climate, to things like the atmospheric chemicals, so I'll say ATM for atmospheric chemicals. All of these are being altered. Things like ecological systems as well. That these are all part of global change scenarios. These are alterations, of course, done by us as humans. Why are these threats to biodiversity? Well, clearly, it makes sense that these are threats to biodiversity because what we do is we directly, through these alterations, reduce the capacity of our own Earth, of the Earth itself. So we're going large scale to the Earth to, and here's this key word one more time, to sustain life. The key is to sustain life. If you reduce that capacity through these alterations, you are clearly causing a threat to biodiversity, as you are with habitat loss and introduced species and overharvesting concepts that we've gone over.